Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Asia Solar Energy for Climate Change Conference, a platform dedicated to harnessing the power of renewable energy in our fight against climate change. This conference is organized by Carbon Care InnoLab and funded by the Jockey Club Charities Trust. My name is Claudia Lee, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this exciting panel discussion. The session today will focus on solar energy and Southeast Asia, and we'll look specifically at the existing opportunities, challenges, as well as the collaborative solutions available. Now, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our three guests for today, Mr. Alberto Dalusong III, Mr. Yanur Fajari, and Mr. Cedric Ramold. So our first guest, Mr. Alberto Dalusong III, is the Energy Transition Advisor at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities in the Philippines. He has had over 30 years of experience in the energy sector with a particular focus on renewable energy development, national energy planning, and policy formulation. Our second guest, Mr. Yanur Fajari, is the Senior Program Officer of Energy Transition Partnerships at the UN Office for Project Services. He is a public policy specialist with a focus on renewable energy and climate change. And Mr. Fajari has advised over 100 companies in the US, EU, and China on policy updates. Last but not least, we have Mr. Cedric Ramold, the Business Development Advisor for Climate Finance Asia and a finance industry veteran. And he's leveraged his over 20-year career in the financial management industry and is now working with the Climate Bonds Initiative to develop the green bonds market in the ASEAN. Mr. Ramold has also previously acted as a consultant to the UN Economic and Social Commission for Green Finance in APAC. And I'm very excited again to be moderating this session. In this session, the key things we'll be covering include the collaborative solutions, which can accelerate the transition to renewables, the latest trends in solar technology, as well as some examples of successful solar energy projects in Southeast Asia. This panel will start off by each guest sharing their insights, and then it'll be followed by a short moderating session where I'll have some questions for the guests, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the participants. So I'm very excited now to officially start the session, starting with a presentation by our first guest, Mr. Alberto Dalusong III. Bert, if you're ready to start, we're also ready for your presentation.
Very much,
Thank
Claudia.
you.
Can you hear me? And my screen? Okay. So let me give you just a few insights from the Philippines. I think the Philippines provides to look at the solar in the context of a power sector which is relatively market-based and free to participate. In the Philippines, we do not subsidize any form of electricity, and therefore solar can compete freely. About three things: key issues affecting Philippine energy, primarily low variability, intermittency of generation, and generation costs. In the Philippines, we have a very, very variable load. The last 12 months, that's 6 months of 2022 and the first 6 months of 2023, we do have allows us to track every 5 minutes the dispatch of all power plants and all loads in the Philippines. So as you can see, highest peaks occurred in May and lowest after Christmas. If we look at the peaks in May, for example, I'm seeing 4,000 megawatts of daily variation. 4,000 megawatts where we have to turn on, turn off, ramp up, ramp down several power plants. In the lowest part of the load, in the lowest of the load profiles, which happens after Christmas, then we're seeing 2,500 megawatts of daily variation. And if you look at this chart, you'll probably see that, indicatively, we're looking at a 6,000 megawatt base load requirement. And our coal-fired power plants alone are over 7,500 megawatts. That means that the coal baseload power plants have to compete amongst themselves for dispatch. And one of the reasons, I think the main reason for this high variability in our load is because our customer profile is primarily dominated by residential accounts. Uh, 39% of our sales are for residential customers, industry far less at 32%. Now, the second point I'd like to talk about is intermittency of generation. Intermittency I define as random starts and stops. If we look at data from last available data is 2021 here that I'm showing, the information on solar and wind capacities in the Philippines show that it is both are predictable within the bounds of predictability set by our grid, by our market operator. Because solar power plants in a particular site, that individual solar power plants have, as you see on the left, the variability of supply. And as we multiply these solar power plants, the variability will only increase. But as we see on the right, the aggregated solar power plants have a smoother generation because as you expand solar within a particular grid, then it sort of smooths out their actual delivery of power into the grid. Not only is is solar and wind predictable, it is also coincident with our peak, as we've seen here, data coming from 2019. Now, let us compare this with baseload power plants in the Philippines. And I'm interested to find out exactly the performance of baseload power plants in other ASEAN countries. But in the Philippines, I'm showing you the best performing power plant, SMC Unit 2. If we look at the largest power plants, a new power plant called the you can see the load profile, the load going down to zero in both units 1 and unit 2. We can say that, for example, we are seeing the random stops and starts that I mentioned earlier. And really, these power plants cycle. That means they ramp up and down on a daily basis. We see the next largest power plants, Suwal at over 600 megawatts each, the same pattern. A random stops and starts outages that we've seen. If we look at our simple cycle gas turbine power plant, a peaking power plant, it's operating at a capacity factor of 53.7%, very high for a peaking power plant, which is indicative of the need to have more flexible generation in our grid. And finally, I'd like to talk of intermittency. The key takeaways from intermittency of generation. First, that solar and wind are variable and predictable. They are not intermittent. And in fact, it's the coal power plants that have demonstrated intermittency. Thus, our peaking power plants like Avion are factors. And because of this intermittency, we are seeing that our grid has had to adjust. And in fact, I would say that the problem of intermittency of our power plants are a bigger problem for the grid than the variability of solar and. Finally, I'd like to talk of generation costs. And we know that fuel costs are at least half of the generation costs. And I'm showing here three fuel price benchmarks that we use locally. Red for Japanese LNG, which is a recent type of power plant that is being promoted locally, and the normal coal index that we use for as a benchmark for fuel costs, for coal fuel costs, and the Dubai Crude Oil Index in blue. As you can see, historically, these have been very, very volatile with an upward trend. If I look at the major distribution utilities in the Philippines, we separate generation, transmission, and distribution. And showing the three largest distribution utilities: Meralco for the Luzon grid, the largest grid; Veco for the Visayas grid; and Davao Light. And as you can see, the blended generation rates are very high. Today, Meralco and Veco are around 7 pesos per kilowatt hour, while Davao Light, which has access to low-cost hydro, down at around 450. Just to give you an idea, 450 is the cost of a typical solar power plant in the Philippines. In other words, very competitive with the blended generation rates of our distribution utilities. And if we compare them with the coal generation rates, we can see that coal generation is even higher because of the immediate impact of the levels of coal fuel prices. For example, in Meralco, the biggest grid, it's about 7 pesos per kilowatt hour. And I said earlier that solar in the Philippines is quite competitive, even at the highest ranges of solar, which is around 4 pesos, 50 centavos per kilowatt hour. So, summarizing, towards clean, affordable, and secure energy, looking at variability, solar generation, while being variable, is able to meet peak demand in our grid. In intermittency, we find that solar generation is variable, predictable, and not intermittent, while it is coal capacity in our grid that have demonstrated random stops and starts and stops. And finally, generation cost. Today, solar is by far the cheapest source of power supply in the Philippines. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I apologize if my internet is unstable.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Bert Delusong, for your very insightful presentation. I mean, I definitely already learned something today, which is that actually coal is more intermittent than solar and wind, which is an extremely important point here. I think it will be very important for many, many corporations to understand the point. Um, so thank you very much. And our next our next guest will be Mr. Inor Fajari. Um, he is the Senior Program Officer of Energy Transition Partnerships at the UNOPS. So we'll be now listening to his presentation. Mr. Yunur Fajari, are you ready for the presentation?
Claudia,
Thank you. Thank you.
wait a moment. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. If you just make it full screen, that will be perfect. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity for inviting me for this event. Yeah, it's an honor for me to attend this event. First of all, my name is Januar. I'm representing the Energy Transition Partnership under the UN systems. Would like to share some knowledge about from the Indonesian point of view in terms of opportunities, challenges, and potential collaboration solutions regarding the solar power in Indonesia. Secondly, I would like to introduce about our projects. We are ETP. ETP is a Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership. It's a multi-donor partnerships formed by the government and philanthropic partners to accelerate sustainable energy transitions in Southeast Asia that in line with the Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals. ETP combines the best of public and private sector within the UN system to help the mobilize and coordinate technical and financial resources to build the foundations of for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and resilience infrastructures. And we empowers our partner countries, currently Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, to transition towards sustainable energy systems, generate economic growth, and ensure energy security. And yeah, under the UN system, we have the UNOPS as our fund managers. That the project is until originally was 2025, but because a lot of response and looking for a long goal, and then it will end until 2035. And our operations, we have strategic outcomes with we call pillars. The first is the policy alignment with climate commitment to achieve net zero emissions. Net zero emissions. We provide high-level technical advisory support by enabling environment, identifying policies, regulations, and laws should be introduced to the government and relevant stakeholders. And then secondly, de-risking renewable energy and energy efficiency investments. We aim to unlock large-scale renewable energy investments by national and international financial institutions while increasing the risking of projects, making them bankable. And then these two factors should be supported by the expanding sustainable resilient infrastructures, which is smart grids. We provide technical solutions to expand smart grids, enable evidence-based planning for national grid systems, and provide capacity building for the grid operators. And last but not least is, of course, to operate these whole ecosystems, we need knowledge and awareness, skill, and capacity development. We develop a comprehensive platform to foster knowledge, build technical and technology expertise through education programs, and establish state-of-the-art centers of excellence. That's our strategic outcomes. And now the third part, yeah, would like to share about the insight about the Indonesian electricity market, particularly about the solar power. The first about the opportunities. I would like to explain a bit different, yeah. Compared to the Philippines, Indonesian electricity market is regulated. It's a monopoly market. Every independent power producer should sell the electricity to the state-owned enterprise. We call it PLN. It's the public utilities that sell the electricity to the general publics. Although there are some captive power market, but mostly the electricity market, it's a single buyer. So all of the IPP must sell the electricity to the state-owned enterprise. And the opportunities is related to the city business plan. So this state-owned enterprise has a plan to add 40 gigawatts of electricity in the next 10 years. From this 40 and 50% of it, which is 20%, which is 20 giga, it's for the renewable energy. And from this 20, 3 giga of it is for solar power. So it's clearly stated on their document that has a strong legal base. There is an opportunity, 3 gigawatts of additional solar power plant. That's for the domestic market. Second opportunities is for the electricity export to Singapore. I think maybe you already know then aware that according to the Energy Market Authority Singapore, they would like to import up to 4 gigawatts low carbon electricity by 2035. I think they already have some kind of tender procurement mechanism, and then the government of Indonesia and the Singapore are currently ongoing discussion about it. And there are already approved trial projects by the government of Singapore, consortium led by the Pacific Light Power, about around 600 megawatts, or equal to 100 megawatt non-intermittent, imported from Bulan Island. Bulan Island is part of Indonesian islands, in Riau Islands. It's totally 4 gigawatts that the government of Singapore stated that they would like to import the renewable energy sources. Yeah, so there are for domestic market, for the export to the Singapore, and third opportunities is the manufacturing of solar module, because based on the Ministry of Industry regulations, for the solar power, there is a local content requirements, which is 40.68%. And most of the IPPs, they cannot fulfill these requirements, so they have to import and ask for some waiver or some kind of discretions about it. Then this creates an opportunity for manufacturer to invest in Indonesia and create and then produce their solar manufacturing in Indonesia that to supply the let's say from domestic and export like around 7 gigawatts in total. That's the opportunity. And the second point, the challenges of solar PV implementation in Indonesia. Even though it is Indonesian case, but I believe other Southeast Asian countries has a similar challenges. The first is limited grid infrastructures because it's an insufficient transmissions and distributions infrastructures in many areas of Indonesia pose a significant challenge to the effective implementation of solar PV, particularly in remote and rural locations. Even though it's not remote and rural, let's say high density areas, if the grid is not upgraded yet, for example, to receive the intermittency of the solar power, is the grid capability to accept it? Because it has to modernize the system, the main control center, the grid, it should be modernized into the smart grid. The currently, according to the state-owned enterprise, a very limited amount the variable renewable energy that can enter into the grid. So they have to upgrade. That's one challenges, limited grid infrastructures. Second, it's the local content requirement policy. Yeah, at the one side, the government would like to enforce these regulations, but the existing industry cannot fulfill the demand. So this is hampering the progress of the solar PV development. If they insist, then the economic will be not competitive because the local producers cannot fulfill the quality, they cannot fulfill the tier 1 BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance standard. It become unbankable and not competitive. And then the third challenge is the lack of supportive policy and regulations, because it's consistent regulations. For example, if for solar rooftop, let's say one of the examples is the solar rooftop policies. According to the Ministry of Energy regulations, yes, if your house required like 2,200 watts, then you are allowed to build solar PV the same amount of it. But then the state-owned enterprise who in charge for this doesn't accept this regulation, so they make their own regulations, only 15 or only 10 to 15%, so only 200 watts. So it's not attractive for a house to just build 10 or 15% of it. And previously also, if you don't use the energy, you can export to the grid and then you can get a return from it. But now it's no more. It's no, you can export, but you cannot get money from it. They cannot claim that energy. So it's just like a free energy for the systems. So these inconsistent regulations make these sectors like there is lack of supportive policies and regulations. And then, yeah, of course, if we talk about the solar power, especially big project, a big chunk of land availability and suitability, that's quite a challenge too. Although there are some kind of solutions like using the reservoir and lake, that's another challenges too, because have to compete with let's say tourism or the water systems. Yeah, the land availability and suitability is quite a challenge. That one of the biggest challenge also faced by the IPPs, to find the suitable land that close to the substations with the very competitive price. It's quite a challenge for them. And then the last is financing and access to capital, because limited access to affordable financing options and hesitance from the banks and financial institutions to invest in renewable energy projects. As a result, high risk, it's considered high risk related to the mentioned challenges as I mentioned earlier, and then make it difficult for businesses to secure the necessary funds for the solar PV implementations. And yeah, the opportunities and challenges, this would like to share some ideas for collaborative solutions. The first is the financial institutions and development banks to design financial instruments and mechanism specifically for solar power. This could involve providing preferential loan terms, lower interest rates, risk mitigation strategies, and the necessary capital to accelerate project development. And then second, collaboration with experts from countries with major solar power plant market to assess grid infrastructure needs and develop strategies to address grid limitations. This could involve technical assistance and capacity building. One example is if our support to the PLN, the state-owned enterprise of the electricity, we support them to design the detailed engineering design to upgrade their main control center so that the VRE can enter into the grid. Second, the third one is collaborate with the international organization and countries with successful solar power markets to develop clear and consistent policies and regulations tailored to the solar PV implementation. Could involve sharing best practices, conducting joint workshop, and seeking expert advice. And last but not least is the risking facilities supported by the development partners such as World Bank, ADB, and similar organizations conduct through pre-feasibility studies to evaluate project feasibility, resource assessment, and technological risks. This builds confidence in project viability. Yeah, one of our examples is we support the Indonesian government to have a 1 gigawatt solar PV mapping and development plan. Yeah, I think that's all my insights and sharing for these sessions. I pass it on to back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yunor Fajar, for giving us this very, very interesting overview of the solar panel outlook in Indonesia, as well as telling us about some of the challenges of scaling solar in Indonesia. I think definitely we know that there are a lot of hurdles to surmount, but then the availability of collaborative solutions like the ones you mentioned is very uplifting. And hopefully a lot of these collaborative solutions will be able to be implemented very soon. So our third and final guest is Mr. Cedric Remold, the Business Development Advisor for Climate Finance Asia. I'd like to welcome him to share his insights over from his many years of working within climate finance.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Climate Finance Asia is a private business advising companies and organizations to implement financial transactions that are aligned with a number of standards that start to appear around the world that drive capital towards green and sustainable projects. So we have several offices in Asia. We have our main office in Hong Kong with experts who can advise on sustainability, ESG, and carbon matters, as well as second-party opinions for green solutions. We have an office in Singapore where I'm speaking from now. And we also have a new office in Japan, in Tokyo, and we are considering partnerships with people on the ground in Taiwan and Korea at the moment as well. So we see a lot of innovations in the field of climate finance. And then there is a reason for that. We had the signature of the Paris Agreement in 2015, where all the countries in the world agreed that we should do something about the global warming and to counter the effects of climate change, we should reorient capital flows towards that objective. So since then, we have seen the emergence of a very active finance market driven by the bond market. You have probably heard of green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds, and a few others. So these are publicly issued securities by companies, governments, by state-owned corporations to access capital from various types of investors who are looking to invest with environmental objectives. There is a number of private deals that are happening as well in the loan markets, where lenders are engaging with borrowers according to some green objectives on specific projects. And where Climate Finance Asia can come in is to help this new type of characterization of the financial deals that are happening. And to do that, there are several standards that exist that we can refer to. The main one that has been the driver of this bond and loan market is the Green Bond Principles, the International Capital Markets Association, or ICMA. In the loan format, it exists from LMA, the Loan Market Association. This is essentially a set of voluntary principles that have been formalized by market participants. So they are voluntary. So anyone who does a transaction can decide to abide by those principles. And they are relatively straightforward. They are based on four main pillars. The first one is that we should design or list for investors the projects that are going to be invested by the capital that is being raised. So these projects can be listed by categories. And it so happened that actually when we look at the dynamics of the green bonds or green loan market, we observe that energy is the largest sector where this capital is looking to invest. And within this energy bucket, obviously solar energy is a very important part of this segment, together with wind energy, geothermal, waste to energy, and hydropower. Now, these types of transaction, so a bond is essentially a long-term borrowing in the public markets to finance a long-term infrastructure project. And typically these solar projects, as well as the other renewable energy projects, they are typically long-dated. They have cash flows that are fairly predictable, as we have seen from the previous speakers. It is possible to model what is the demand for energy and what is through the power purchase agreement that is signed with utility companies like Meralco or PLN or EGAT in Thailand and others. It's possible to have a fairly good estimate of the cash flows that these projects will generate. And therefore, a bond financing or a loan financing is the perfect instrument to finance these types of projects, because the bond or the loan is also a fairly predictable way of borrowing money to know what is the interest rate that's due every year and what is the principal that is due either at maturity or during the life of the project. So it's possible to match the cash flows of those renewable energy from the revenue side with the expenses in terms of the interest and the capital that needs to be repaid on the borrowing side. So that's why we see those types of financing gaining a lot in popularity in driving capital towards these projects. And it's really a success since 2017, 2018, when this market really started. Globally, we have reached $4 trillion of bonds that have been issued with a label, be it with a green bond market, the largest share of this capital that is being raised. And this is good news, because that means that this capital is looking to be invested only in those projects that are characterized as green. And according to the principle, the issuer has to reserve this capital only to those projects. It's not possible to use this cash for something else, otherwise it cannot be called a green bond. And also there is an increasing demand from investors for more reporting by the borrowers. So it's also the third pillar of the principles, where borrowers have to report on how the capital is allocated, and also what is the impact of that capital in terms of, for example, what quantity of installed capacity being enabled by this capital. So this reporting is very important in demonstrating the power of this capital and the implementation of those projects. Now, one particularity that we have in our region, in Southeast Asia in particular, is that despite the $4 trillion of thematic bond issuance that we have seen in ASEAN, we have seen only $50 billion. So it's a very tiny amount compared to the global numbers. The global numbers are really driven by the larger markets like EU, the US, China, Australia, and others, where there is an active bond market. But the ASEAN region is relatively less developed in terms of using these types of instruments to finance economic activity. It's a market that is more dominated by bank lending. And indeed, we have seen a number of banks come to the market by issuing those types of securities and then using the capital to lend to their clients in the form of bilateral loans to their small and medium-sized enterprises, for example. So the banks are very important in driving this intermediation of capital in the region, but yet it's happening relatively slowly. And that's kind of counterintuitive because, as we heard from the previous speaker, there is a huge need for capital to finance this transition from the existing legacy systems that we have in ASEAN, based on fossil fuels, primarily on coal, but also gas and oil, towards solar, towards wind, and towards other renewable energy. Now, the capital is ready to invest if we look at the global numbers. Yet in ASEAN, it seems to be relatively complicated to find projects that are bankable, that are acceptable for investors, where the credit risk is acceptable and where investors are willing to engage. There is a problem with the currency of the issuance. A lot of the activity that is happening in the region is to do it in the domestic currency of the projects to avoid the exposure to foreign exchange, for example. Yet the capital that is available overseas is mostly in US dollar, euros, or yen. So maybe there's something where there is an opportunity to innovate and try to find the organizations that can help bridge that risk problem that exists, maybe by developing hedging mechanism, or maybe in the countries it's possible to denominate the power purchase agreement in foreign currency so that the project owner does not have a mismatch, for example. Now, the other problem, as we heard in the case of the Philippines, is that sometimes the demand for energy is very localized, or it's in the hands of very small holders or residential households. So we can innovate by finding new financing mechanism where it's possible to finance rooftop solar in small neighborhoods that will allow households to get the energy they want to use from solar sources. So we need to develop those mechanisms. And again, banks can help. Microfinance institutions is another type of borrowers that could raise financing in the global markets and use that capital, sometimes at concessional rates, to finance the need of investment from smallholders. So that's another possibility. It's still work in progress. It's a market that is relatively new, that needs to be developed further. There is a number of organizations that can help in this transformation. Development financial institutions like the Asian Development Bank, the IFC, the AIIB, and a few others. Some of them have created guarantee mechanism like CGIF, which is a trust of the Asian Development Bank that offers guarantees for bond issuance. Or there's another organization supported by multilaterals called GuarantCo as well, which is quite active in supporting bond issuers to access capital when there is a problem of risk of the borrower. There are solutions that exist also for the currency hedging. We have seen innovative solutions from the TCX fund based in Amsterdam, which is a multilateral backed fund that offers currency hedging, especially for emerging markets economies. Also, we have seen the active development of an impact finance asset management industry, where a number of players are active in the region, mostly from Switzerland, the Netherlands, France, Germany, where there are funds that look to invest with a purpose to really also provide financing at the bottom of the pyramid, as we say, to try to help the banking institutions that are active on the ground to provide smaller scale loans that could be branded as green and could finance small scale solar panels for small users. So it's a very active segment that is developing. There's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of innovation as well. We see an active field developing also on the equity side, where a lot of funds are to support new projects and new type of technologies to get these renewable energy projects up and running. So it's quite encouraging, but again, the problem is that we still have to deal with a very heavy legacy system where coal is a very primary source of electricity generation, and it's complicated because it's a big change that we have to put in place in the economies. In Indonesia, for example, with the situation of PLN is quite critical. The high coal price means that PLN as a corporation is not really generating a profit and needs to rely on subsidies from the government to be able to offer electricity at affordable rates. So this is not a viable system in itself. So we need to urgently find a solution also at the country level. And this is happening too. The countries have been implementing frameworks. There is an active discussion happening among finance players on how to provide a framework for the early retirement of coal-fired so that we can replace them with more sustainable sources of energy. It takes a little bit of time because these are big projects that need to be financed, and a lot of investors across the globe have already enacted policies where they cannot finance either coal or other forms of fossil fuels. So when there is a need for capital involving a coal-fired plant that needs to be retired, oftentimes these investors are reluctant because it's a way of financing. And we need to put a framework in place so that this becomes possible. I think we have to be quite hopeful that over time we will find the correct projects to finance and the right setup, the right frameworks. But the good news is that when we look around us, we see that in the developed markets where those policies already exist, capital is flowing towards the right energy projects, and a very quick and fast expansion of the renewable energy sector in those markets. So the same can happen in the region, and we need to continue working hard like we do day to day on designing frameworks and trying to solve the gaps that this market still has in order for investors to be interested in these projects. So I can speak more about this green bond market, but I hope I have given you a little bit of an overview on how this is developing already, and I stand ready to answer some of your questions. Back to you, moderator.
Mr. Romuald, for telling us all about opportunities in green bonds and climate finance, as well as some of the challenges. I think it's really interesting to understand some of the projects that the investors are interested in, and also some of the challenges when it comes to Asia. But it's, again, like you said, very uplifting to know that there's a lot of investor interest and that a lot of frameworks are already existing. So definitely a lot of opportunities available for projects in Asia. So this next part, I will be moderating the panel. I'll be asking some questions to the panelists, and then we'll move on to the final part, which is the Q&A with some questions by the participants. And I see that there are already some interesting questions that the participants have posed to the panelists. So first, let's start with 10 minutes of questions from myself. So I think one important thing that I want to discuss is because Mr. Romuald just talked about climate finance being that there are certain important criteria for the projects to be bankable and for investors to be interested. And previously, Mr. Fajori talked about how in Indonesia, there's a lack of access to this type of finance. And I guess it'll be interesting to see what are some what's the criteria for a bankable project, apart from currency. For instance, is it scale? Is it duration or feasibility? What makes a project interesting to the investors and that one that they're willing to invest in? So any of the panelists can answer this. I guess would maybe Mr.
Others are shy. Maybe I can give a few
Sure.
ideas. Yeah. First of all, on the scale of projects, I think that if you're looking at renewable energy projects, then you're really looking essentially at smaller projects because renewables are definitely smaller in scale per project than say a coal-fired power plant, which in the Philippines can be almost 700 megawatts per unit and probably 2 by 700 per project. So a typical biomass power plant is 20 megawatts. Our largest solar is 132 megawatts. So there is a scale difference. Also, I think that I heard power supply agreement. Now, Claudia, I'm now in Mindanao and I'm helping develop a project, solar rooftop project that will not depend on any PSA. There is a power market in the Philippines. And you can understand, you can do your analytics on our power market and sell to the grid on a merchant basis. And that's exactly what our business model is. That's a new for the Philippines. In other words, I think that bank lending will still be a major. I hope that green finance can extend and better understand the Philippine market so that they will be more open to financing different business models that will promote projects in general and solar investments in particular. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I can share some experience. In the Philippines, we were looking at one of our clients, which was essentially looking to offer small scale financing for projects, like you said, of relatively small size. And then as they reach a critical mass, then they would be able to finance it with investors who are requiring a certain size invest. The challenge for them was the ability to execute quickly enough so that they could ramp up to a certain scale. And it seemed that they were struggling a little bit in executing some of those small projects and aggregating them into portfolios. And the same thing is happening with banks. I think banks are expanding relatively quickly in this type of green loans where they offer attractive forms of financing for solar projects. Hopefully, the banks can also refinance those loans through the bond market and have access to the investors that require larger tickets before they can invest. But I would say that actually there is an investor type for every type of projects. Even the smaller size projects can be financed by, for example, what I was saying earlier, those impact investors who are looking to provide smaller ticket items, smaller ticket financing for smaller scale projects. It doesn't need to be necessarily billions of dollars every time. We are seeing financing that the latest green bonds in Singapore for some biofuel production was 50 million Singapore dollar. So it's very small in the bond market, yet it was able to print with a relatively large number of investors run by large international banks. And that was a successful deal. And we see other very large transactions The Singapore government issued a green bond of 2.3 billion Singapore dollars last year to finance a number of different projects. So there is financing of different sorts of size for different projects. The complexity is that it's still relatively difficult to put everything together so that investors are satisfied that all the boxes are ticked. There is the issue of credit risk, of legal enforcement of contracts, or who is the sponsor. There is an ESG due diligence that must happen, and investors are very careful about investing in projects that are not really fully bulletproof against controversies. We've seen a number of projects that failed because of I think there is clearly a need for the region to learn more about how to come up with projects that are well documented and well structured. But I think more and more examples are showing that this is happening. It's just a matter of time before we see that really accelerating in the momentum.
Thank you so much, both Bert and Cedric, for a very insightful comment. I think it's great to know that there are definitely opportunities available for solar, well, for climate finance in the region, and that already some investors are interested in investing in projects of different scales. So I have one more question, and then I think after that we can move on to the Q&A section. And something else that's quite key is a just transition, because I think although there are a lot of opportunities in renewables, there will be displacement of coal and natural gas workers as well. So how can we ensure that the transition is just and that these workers are also equipped with the skills they need to then provide a livelihood for them as renewable energy in the like ASEAN region is scaled? Again, this question is for all three panelists, so anybody can answer this.
I think we must keep in mind that this transformation, this energy transition that is going to happen, is also going to create a lot of new jobs. There's going to be a need for slightly different skill sets, but not too far from what exists already. And there's an opportunity to really, find the opportunities that those workers you're talking about can convert into these new business opportunities. It's just that we haven't really seen yet those projects develop massively, but I'm quite confident that this transformation will create opportunities for workers. And obviously, when we are talking about the transition of a coal-fired plant, we are not talking about switching it overnight. It's over a number of years that this will happen. There will be a ramp-up phase where the coal capacity will be scaled down, and then the renewable energy projects will come into force. So there is time to also factor that in. And I think the investors are quite aware of the just transition aspect of things. And it's part of those things that must be considered when coming to the market with a credible project, to also factor that in. But again, you have to keep in mind that climate change is also going to affect disproportionately the poorest of the populations in our society. So actually, transitioning to renewable energy is also protecting them, and keeping the legacy system relying on coal and fossil fuel is a way also to not be just for those people as well, who are very exposed, especially in Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of coastlines, people who are living off agriculture and fisheries and all the rest of it, which are very impacted by the impact of climate change, as well as people living in cities, which are very affected by the high levels of pollutions and the problem of access to sanitation and others. So it's a complex problem, but I think we have a a lot of knowledge already, and the standards that are put in place also factor this type of parameters when considering new projects.
Yes, I'd like to add that
Mhm.
totally agree with everything Cedric said. But I'd like to add that because renewables are more distributed, they're more dispersed, there are more opportunities for a larger group of areas than they were if we continue to rely on centralized fired power plants. So I wouldn't worry too much about skill set, as was already stated. Uh, the same skill set would practically apply to other renewables. And the benefit is it's more spread out, and more communities will now benefit from these projects without suffering from the environmental impacts of fossil fuel power plant generation. Thank you.
Can I add?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, would like to give comment also with the previous questions and then the question that you just raised. Yeah, regarding the bankability, of course, there are many factors that the bank considers. I would like to highlight the two major that based on the Indonesian experience. The first is the solar resource assessment, the accurate and reliable data and weather conditions at the project site are crucial, that there are confirmed that there are the solar resource there. That's the first. And then the second is the technology and equipment. The quality and the performance of solar panels, inverters, and other systems are components, are vitals. And one of the reference that they use is the Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They have a specific list which kind of solar module that are eligible for the international finance. It's the tier one. It has some criteria that this solar module already being used in two other solar minimum 2 megawatts and get funding from different two financing institutions. It's very specific on that. So if it's not included on that list, then the international banks cannot prefer not to. That's the major 2 points on the Indonesian experience. And regarding the just transition aspects, in relation to the coal-fired power plant, yes, the Indonesia currently assessing the impacts of the earlier retirements. Actually, the just transition aspects, it's a complex issues. Actually, it's not only about the people and communities. From the government point of view, it's gonna be a lot of potent revenue loss because let's say, especially related to the coal activities. For example, coal mining activities, they generate tax income or tax. It will be impacted, not only the central government, especially the local government, because they have a part portion of it that impact the government budgets. Then they have to anticipate it. They have to make a projections how many state budget will be impacted by this early retirement, for example, and then have to mitigate these impacts. And in terms of communities, yes, it's creating new jobs. Then what the government must do is collaborating with the investors. Sometimes the local people there, the skill set don't really match with the needs of the renewable. So there should be a program that really tailored, targeting the affected communities, like a kind of capacity building so that they can tap the job market in this renewable energy.
Yes, thank you so much to all of the three panelists for sharing. I think definitely it's a very good way to shift to understand the problem in that like keeping legacy systems existing, like keeping and natural gas plants existing is actually in a way more unjust, unfair because it ends up polluting the communities. And also interesting to consider that a just transition also includes the loss of government revenue, which and how this affects the economy. Um, So thank you very much for all of the interesting perspectives and answers. So now it's 8 a.m. and I think, sorry, it's 8 a.m. but it should be 3 p.m. in Hong Kong. And I think it would be a good time to transition to the Q&A. So now I'll be reading some questions from our participants, some of which are addressed to all three panelists and some of them are addressed specifically to one. I will start off with a question from Miko Wong. And their question is, how can Southeast Asian countries leverage international partnerships and funding mechanisms to accelerate the deployment of solar energy and overcome financial barriers? So this question is open to all three panelists to answer. Let me know if you need me to repeat the question. Cedric, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of finding the right projects that will satisfy the conditions from investors. It's all a problem of matching because investors have very strict conditions under which they can invest. Very often, these investors are driven by investment policies that are decided with their clients. It could be pension funds, it could be sovereign wealth funds, it can be asset management products like funds that are offered publicly to investors. So these types of funds have very strict guidelines on what they can and cannot do. And sometimes the projects that are shown to them don't fit the bill. Even though I said the rise of the green bond market has been very strong, we still hear investors say that on average they reject maybe 30 to 40% of the green projects that are shown to them. Even in the form of a green bond, because they maybe don't fully subscribe to the whole strategy of the issuer, or maybe there are some other parameters that prevent them from. So this market still needs to develop further so that there's better understanding from the project sponsors and the investors how they can match and how this capital can flow. And the role of development financial institutions and philanthropies sometimes can be quite critical in bridging that gap. Sometimes the fact that there is a development institution in the mix can reassure investors that the correct due diligence has been done. So maybe there is an opportunity to open those financing where a development institution is involved so that private investors can participate more. There is this new term called blended finance, which basically represents project which associates private interests together with concessional interests, be it from a development side or a philanthropy. Maybe more of this type of projects can help develop this market further, and especially for Southeast Asia.
Is there anybody else who'd like to share their insights on this question? Okay. If not, we can move on to the next question, which is specifically posed to Bert from Natalie Sum. So the question is, as mentioned, the generation cost for solar is the lowest in the Philippines. Has labor costs and the long-term maintenance been taken into account?
Yes, yes. So considering all costs, then solar generation is much lower than, say, coal generation costs. Today, if I look at the typical generation cost of a coal-fired power plant as reflected in generation cost breakdowns of distribution utilities, that number is 8.5. And as I said earlier, 4.5 is certainly a doable number for a typical solar power project in the Philippines. So almost half the cost today.
To this question. Okay, so the next question is also about solar from Mr. Ken Tai. His question is, solar will generate most power during the daytime. So will the Philippines adjust its coal generation period daily to cover the nighttime usage? Or will the solar generation be stored in some other format?
Yeah, I think that as I've already shown, what's happening is coal generation is cycling every day. We have an overcapacity of coal-fired baseload power plants, and they compete themselves for dispatch. Remember, we have a priority policy for renewable energy in the Philippines. So what's happening is they cycle. That cycling has affected their reliability. That's why we're seeing a lot of these random outages from coal-fired power. It's a very dynamic thing, power generation. And our system, even if we have, for example, we have 600 megawatts of pump storage hydro, that's essentially a battery in the Luzon grid. We cannot deal with the variability of our load and the overcapacity of our baseload power plants. That's why they have to cycle every day, all of them.
Yes, actually was specifically for birds since it's about the Philippines. So thank you for your answer, Bert. And now let's move on to the final question we have for now, although I think there may be some more questions that are coming up. So this is quite a long question. I'll read it out first, and if any of the panelists want me to repeat that, I'm happy to. This is a question from Pavitra Nayak. So they said that in regards to land acquirement for solar projects, an issue that I've seen, especially in rural agricultural heavy areas, is that there is often a local push as the land required often encroaches on their agricultural property and even risks massively impacting their day-to-day lives. What would be a good way to face this issue on such problems without negatively affecting local economies? So I guess what they're saying really is that when it comes to acquiring land for solar projects, or I guess any renewable projects, there's pushback because it encroaches on agricultural property and affecting livelihoods in the way rural communities earn money. What's a good way to sort of acquire land without negatively affecting agricultural or local communities?
Yeah, just if I may, just a quick reply from the Philippine case. First of all lands for solar generation will have to be converted from agricultural to, if they are agricultural lands, they will have to be converted for industrial use, which is what you need before you can turn those lands into solar farms. So, in other words, process in using it as actual agricultural land, I believe that there's practically no way to convert that into land for a solar farm. However, for those idle lands that may still be arable, idle for several years, those have the potential for being converted into solar farms. So, in other words, if it's productive land, I don't see that happening. If it's land for that has not been put to productive use, then it is possible, even if it is arable land. So in that case, in both cases, I believe that would have minimal impact on agricultural production or productivity.
There is also an opportunity, we see it in Singapore, where there's not much of agricultural land, for solar rooftop and or also floating solar. So there is definitely room for innovation also in spaces that are not used for agriculture that can still support solar systems. So I think that's an opportunity. Again, this is about finding the scale projects and then aggregating them into larger pools of capital so that they can still be deployed at scale, because it's quite time consuming to go after small projects. A rooftop can only be so big. So there are opportunities. We see that happening more and more here in Singapore. One of our clients was for which we developed inbound framework was actually doing that kind of business, and it can be quite successful.
Yes, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, I'm in Mindanao to do a solar rooftop project. This project will probably be 15 or so megawatts.
Are you struggling for financing for this type of project?
No, but we haven't. We're still developing the project, but we're seeing that bank lending might be a way to go for this particular project.
Yeah,
local bank lending.
Yeah, would like to add from the Indonesian context, kind of similar with the Philippines. Yeah, it's the on the government regulation already. They have kind of a map, right? Which one the agricultural land, which one is the forestry land, which one the resident area and the industrial area. Yeah, highly regulated. It's not easy to change the zone and the function of the land. So in the first place, then it must be avoided that if that kind of challenges that will be faced if they could go through. But yeah, so I would say that even though it's not impossible for the agriculture, it's possible, but it's gonna be a very lengthy process. But the solar power, you can just choose another land that it's not agricultural land. And even though it's not agriculture and then maybe unproductive, but there is some not risk, kind of challenge. Yes, there are some local people there who occupy the land. The first is how do we engage with them? Yeah, usually must engage with the local government who has some relation communities with the local people. That is very important. It's the way how the investors communicate with them, because sometimes they don't really familiar with the local wisdom there. So must engage with the local government there. And in terms of the local economies, usually it depends what's in there on the land. Then usually they can appraise the land, and then what are the economic activities on the land. Then based on the fair appraisal, that they can agree to mitigate such a pushback from the local communities who occupy the land.
Actually, we are working with a project in Indonesia. It's actually for rice mills. It's a solar project that will sell the power to the rice mills. And like in the example that was shown for the Philippines, there's actually a good match between producing solar energy during the day and the rice mills being active during the day. So there's no problem of intermittency as well. So in that particular case, the local people are actually welcoming this kind of offer to benefit from lower energy sources. So there are many examples where the local communities are favorable if they can benefit from this type of new projects. And these many more opportunities like that could be considered.
For your sharing. I think Cedric's last example was extremely interesting and very inspiring to know that there are certain examples, case studies that are beneficial for both the environment as well as the local communities, and definitely would love to see more examples like this coming in the near future. So I think now I've gone through all the Q&A from the participants, and there are not any more new questions for now. So it's a good time for me to now conclude the session. And on behalf of Carbon Care in the Lab, I would like to thank firstly all of our three speakers, Mr. Alberto Dallasong III, Mr. Yanur Fajari, and Mr. Cedric Rameau, for your very, very insightful presentations and for participating in the panel discussion. I'm sure all the participants, including myself, took a lot away from the session. And it's very good to understand, concrete initiatives from the Philippines and Indonesia, as well as understand the climate finance challenges and opportunities in ASEAN. So the session is recorded and will be available for any participants who want to refer to it in the future for reference. I'm sure all of us, because there was so much detail in it, all of us would like to listen to this again and really, really dial down on some of the details and case studies involved. So yes, this is the end of today's session. I am very happy to be able to moderate for you and really enjoyed all the sharing from the panelists. Thank you again on the behalf of Carbon Care InnoLab, and enjoy the rest of your evening.